Hello, so this is going to be part 2 to the video that I made the other day on language games and Wittgenstein. So, yeah, I'm just going to read through the second page of this booklet and see how long it takes to break it down, really, and that'll depend on whether I go through maybe 2 pages or not, which I doubt will be the case. Actually, I'll read through the language game section and then it'll finish like halfway down the second page, so I think that should be alright. Try not to make the video too long. Let's get rid of this. There we go. Right, okay. Words have meaning only in the context of a game. So if words have use in life, they have meaning, so we cannot brush aside large areas of language as nonsensical as the Vienna Circle did. Okay, so if words have use in life, so this is like almost like a pragmatic view to language, I guess. If a word is useful, then it has meaning. So if words have use in life, they have meaning. Okay, so words that we use in life are meaningful. Is that necessarily the case? Well, if we didn't use the word and it didn't have, if we did use a word and it didn't have meaning, then if we did use a word and it didn't have meaning, then what would be the point in doing that? I think that makes sense, right? So if words have use in life, if we use words, then they must have a meaning. And we use pretty much all words, therefore all the words have meaning. But up here it says words have meaning only in the context of a game. So that means that words only have meaning when they're being used, when they're being used in a specific context outside of a game. Like I was saying last time, that the word intrinsically doesn't necessarily mean anything. It only means something when you put it into the context of a game. Yeah, that seems to make sense. So we cannot brush aside large areas of language as nonsensical as the Vienna Circle did. And the Vienna Circle were essentially, I believe, the start of logical positivism, who were influenced by Ludwig Wittgenstein. And so that they based their knowledge on the Tractatus, which was a book that he wrote. And they said that, I think they talked about the verification principle, maybe, analytic statements, synthetic statements, and meaningless statements. So an analytic statement is one which doesn't rely on any other fact for its existence. For example, a bachelor is an unmarried man. It's like you don't need to go and look into the world in order to be able to find out that is the case. You know that a bachelor is an unmarried man because by definition, bachelor means unmarried man. But whereas a synthetic statement is one where you make the statement and then you have to test it to see if it's factually correct. It's a factual statement, but you have to test whether it's correct by using empirical or sensual experience. For example, I could say my hoodie is grey. If I look at my hoodie, I can see that it's grey. So I can then verify that is true, but it's not necessary that my hoodie is grey. So it's not an analytic statement. The truth isn't contained within the statement itself. It's that I can use empirical experience in order to be able to validate or invalidate whether that synthetic statement is true or false. And in this case, it happens to be true. Okay, so a meaningless statement, according to logical positivism, is one which can't be tested, one that you can't know to be true or false. For example, God exists, God loves us. There might be, within the context of a religious language game, those statements might be perceived to be true, but according to logical positivism, those statements aren't true because they can't be tested. You can't know if God exists for certain because you can't prove God's existence and you can't disprove God's existence. So those statements are apparently meaningless. So that's a little bit of background to the Vienna Circle and logical positivism and how they took Wittgenstein's earlier work, which was the Tractatus, and developed the theory of logical positivism from that. And we could go back even further and say that we can look at where positivism came from, and this was a guy called Auguste Comte, and I made a video about him maybe a month ago or something, and he talked about the three stages of society, and these were theological, which broke down into three parts, but I won't get into that right now because it's slightly off topic, but not completely. So theological, metaphysical, and positivism, which was science technically. Yeah, and he thought that science was the only one which had meaning, and that's the stage that we were in now, and that's what the Vienna Circle also used, and Wittgenstein, I'm guessing, to develop their own theories of society. But I'm not confident enough in making that link. So yeah, right, I'll just carry on reading this. Wittgenstein used the word game to warn against the attempt to define words too precisely. How would you define a game? Okay, I think I already did that last time. There are overlapping characteristics between games at one end of the spectrum and at the other. Wittgenstein said it was like strands of a rope, which combine to form a sturdy rope, but the strands at one end do not reach to the other. So the point is not to press for more precision than the use of a word allows. Jerry Gill calls this the principle of sufficient precision. So it goes back to that idea that we shouldn't be too strict in defining language, and because we can only define a word within the context of a game, we like I've said, I'll say again, a word in and of itself doesn't necessarily have meaning until it's put into use, until it's put into a game. But is this true? Like, could you define language without using it in the context of a game? Well, if language is a game, then no, you can't. Yeah, I don't know about that. Seems to make sense. Okay, Wittgenstein used the word game to warn against the attempt to define words too precisely. Makes sense. There are overlapping characteristics between games at one end of the spectrum to the other. Wittgenstein said it was like strands of a rope which combine to form a sturdy rope, but the strands at one end do not reach to the other. So the point is not to press for more precision than a word allows. And this is called The Principle of Sufficient Precision by Jerry Gill. Okay, so here I wrote, we can't be too precise with our definitions because this pins language down. Contradictory to early Wittgenstein, anything worth saying can be said clearly. Okay. Wittgenstein proposed that religious language is anti-realist, expressing a form of life without making statements that are true or false. However, he did not think that there was a particular category that you might call religious language. Okay. Wittgenstein proposed that religious language is anti-realist. Right, expressing a form of life without making statements that are true or false. Okay, so religious language is played in a game, expressing a form of life, right, without making statements that are true or false. So, if we then go to what it says up here, so if words have use in life, they have meaning. So, I guess the form of life is the way that you enact a language game. So, religious language it has pragmatic value. People use it in their lives. But it doesn't make statements that are true or false. So that's saying it's unverifiable. It's like you can't say whether language is... You can't say it's meaningless. Okay. No, the logical positivist would say that that's meaningless because it can't be... It doesn't make... Okay, this is confusing. However, he did not think that there was a particular category that you might call religious language. So is this the idea that religious language is the same language which is used in other contexts? I don't understand this. Wittgenstein proposed that religious language is anti-realist. Okay, so religious language promotes say something that isn't real, but what is real? Wittgenstein proposed that religious language is anti-realist. So it's language that goes against what is real, but then it depends on what you mean by real, doesn't it? Because, well, it's hard to define reality. Is reality just the empirical world? Is it that which can be observed? Or does it go further than that? Like within religions, I know that they use a lot of symbols and parables and different forms of meaning to try and convey what they mean by God. And that might be anti-realist, but it depends what you mean by real. So he proposed that religious language is anti-realist, which perhaps is the case in the scientific sense, in that it doesn't necessarily say something about the empirical or the scientific world, but it might say something about more of a metaphysical world, expressing a form of life. So, what does he mean by form of life? Without making statements that are true or false. And that's because it's unverifiable. You can't test it through science. You can't test whether God exists because it's beyond science. It's metaphysical almost. So, however, he did not think that there was a particular category that you might call religious language. So what does he mean by that? I don't know. Is it like that religions don't have their own special language that can't be used in other contexts? That can't be used within other games? Now, perhaps that is the case. However, he did not think that there was a particular category that you might call religious language. Okay, when you say religious language, that I guess that links to words only having meaning in the context of a game. Like to suggest that there is a specific category of religious language is to suggest that there are words which are only useful in the context of a religious game or in the context of a religious language game. But most words used in everyday life are also used in the context of religious games. There's not much distinction there. It's like you can use what you can use words that are used in the context of a religious language game in the context of other games as well. So maybe that's what he means by there's no particular category that you might call religious language. Okay, language can be correctly or incorrectly used within the rules of a game, but its primary purpose is not to make factual statements. It is non-cognitive. All forms of life have their own language and hence stand alone from each other. The player of one language game cannot criticize the player of another, or enter into the game without first learning the rules and conventions of language. Okay, so is that true? The player of one language game cannot criticize the player of another. So that's like, I guess you could link that to a modern example of scientists criticizing religion based on the unfactual claims that it makes about the world, or seemingly makes. For example, creation stories. So and I think even religious people fall into this trap as well. The fact that some religious fundamentalists, they look at the Bible as a scientific scripture or a scientific textbook, perhaps would be a better way to look at it. And this is also how most scientists look at the Bible. And obviously, if you do look at it from the context of a scientific language game, then you're going to be able to criticize that heavily because it makes some what seem to be extremely unscientific claims. For example, I think there's a part in the Bible that talks about the four corners of the world, and this has obviously given rise to the flat Earth controversy. Yeah, and obviously there's things about Jesus turning was it wine into blood or bread into flesh or things like that, and yeah, I might be the other way around, but but obviously, if you're going to look at those statements from in the context of a scientific language game, then you're going to come to the conclusion that those statements are false. Whereas perhaps you have to look at them within the context of a religious language game, whereby those statements could be symbolically true. They could have some sort of symbolic reference to reality in them, but it's not necessarily that they are completely scientifically true. So the player of one language game cannot criticize the player of another. So, okay, I guess that could be the case sometimes, but I'm not sure about all times. Or enter into the game without first learning the rules and conventions of the language. Wittgenstein illustrated the principle like this. Suppose someone is ill and he says, "This is a punishment." And I say, "If I'm ill, I don't think of it a punishment at all." If you say, "Don't you believe the opposite?" you can call it believing the opposite, but it is entirely different from what people normally call believing the opposite. I think differently, in a different way. I say things to myself, I have a different picture. Okay. And then here I've done a little footnote and said, it is not enough to simply say someone thinks the opposite. The two perspectives may be composed completely, uniquely. Opposing view is a simplification, perhaps. So that was my initial thoughts when I first read through this, and I think I wrote that last year or something. Or not, yeah, when we first did this topic. But I think it's quite hard to get your head around because I'm thinking about the meanings of words in a lot of detail, more so than I would normally, because this is about language. And yeah, so this is a punishment. If someone is ill and he says, "This is a punishment," and I say, "If I'm ill, I don't think of it as a punishment at all." If you say, "Don't you believe the opposite?" See, I don't understand how that's supposed to be read. You can call it believing the opposite, but it is entirely different from what people normally call believing the opposite. I think differently, in a different way. I see different things to myself. I say different things to myself. I have a different picture. Okay, so is this talking about the subjective use of language? I have a different picture. So is this like I have a different view of reality? I have a different view of what the word opposite means? Because the meaning of a word isn't intrinsic to the word itself. It's assigned by the individual, essentially. It's like how does the individual perceive the meaning of a word? And there's going to be some commonality between the way that people perceive the meanings of words within specific games, but there's also going to be differences. Like, it could be that these two people are playing different language games. But this seems to be more about opposite. This is a punishment. If I'm ill, I don't think of it as a punishment at all. So perhaps this is a punishment. So that person could have a different definition of punishment to the person who says they don't think of it as a punishment at all. And I feel like this is more focusing on the word opposite, but you can also look at punishment, because if one person's saying something is a punishment and so another person is saying something isn't a punishment, it's like, how do you know that they're in consensus over what the word punishment actually means? And that is probably the case that they're not. Because I guess to say that if you're ill and it's a punishment, then that's almost like a religious statement, because it's like, well, maybe you've done something sinful and you've got ill because of it, so it's like God's punishing you. Whereas I'd say an atheist is more likely to say that if I'm ill, I don't think of it as a punishment at all. You just think of it as science. It's just nature. It's just our biology. We're vulnerable to the outside world, and we're prone to illness and disease. So yeah, and obviously you can look at the word opposite and say, well, this could have ambiguous meaning as well, because well, what do you mean by opposite and what do you mean by punishment? Those two things have to be taken into account here. So I've discussed punishment, but opposite. Okay, so opposite can also be opposite. Well, any word is dependent on the context for it to have meaning. So when you use the word opposite, do you mean it in the same way that I mean opposite? And obviously, that I think that the way that we use opposite changes based on whatever language game we're playing at a specific time. So I might so opposite could mean difference, or it could mean polarity, but it's I think I can't pin it down, but I'm trying to find a meaning of a word here outside of the context of a language game. So I'd have to go into a language into some sort of context in order to be able to define opposite. So here it is. I think the opposite here is this is a punishment, and this person's saying I don't think of it as a punishment. So are those two things opposites? Because that to say this is a punishment, that's like a cognitive statement, or is that right? No, it's not. It's a non-cognitive statement, but it's a factual statement. And then this one here is an opinion. I don't think of it as a punishment at all. So you could say that those are opposites in that a factual statement and an opinion. Now, the factual statement doesn't have to necessarily be true, but the way that it's spoken is as if it's a factual statement. This is a punishment. Okay, if I'm ill, I don't think of it. I don't think of punishment at all. Oh wait, I don't think of punishment at all. So that's sort of conveying some sort of meaning. If I'm ill, I don't think of punishment at all. Okay, so those are, those are two completely different statements almost. So it's hard to say whether they're the opposite or not, because it depends on the meaning of, it depends on what you mean by opposite. Okay, if you say, don't you believe the opposite, you can call it believing the opposite, but it's entirely different from what people normally call believing the opposite. I think differently in a different way. I say different things to myself. I have a different picture. Okay. So is it to say I have a different picture? That's like I have a different model of reality. I perceive the world differently to how you perceive the world, and that means that we perceive language differently as well, and we use language differently. Right, I think I'm going to move on from there because I got maybe a bit bogged down with that one, but it's complicated stuff, so I think it requires a little bit of time to be put into it. Right, pretty far into this video already, but yeah, I'll do this last bit. Okay, the two understanding. Oh, this is actually an explanation of it, I think. The two understandings of illness described in this conversation reflect different forms of life, neither necessarily right or wrong. They use language in different ways and need to be understood in that context. If we misunderstand the way religious language claims are made, then we will respond in the wrong way, like the scientist who rushes off to the laboratory to test the contents of the chalice, having heard it described as the blood of Christ in Eucharist's service. Wittgenstein said of this kind of misunderstanding, for a blunder that's too big. By means of the verification principle, the logical positivists were attempting to lay down before you start the conditions. By means of the verification principle, the logical positivists were attempting to lay down before you start the conditions for meaningful discourse. Okay, I think there's a grammatical mistake there. After initially sharing this type of approach, Ludwig Wittgenstein concluded that it is false because it fails to appreciate the variety and subtlety of language as it is actually used. The variety and subtlety of language as it is actually used. So this is quite a difference from, I think this is later Wittgenstein talking actually, because early Wittgenstein was much more on the side of positivism and meaningful language, and saying that most language was meaningless. Okay, by means of verification principle, the logical positivists were attempting to lay down before you start the conditions for meaningful discourse, right? So the verification principle was something that the logical positivist devised that I just explained a bit ago, about analytic, synthetic, and meaningless statements. So the logical positivists were attempting to lay down a set of foundations on which we could base our language upon before the language had been used. And for Wittgenstein, as we can derive from reading most of this booklet, that he didn't like the fact that he didn't think that language could be pinned down to something. He didn't think that language had a specific definition outside of the context of a language game. So he doesn't like this idea that we can automatically write off some statements as meaningless or analytic or synthetic because it relies on language having a specific meaning, perhaps. And he says it concluded that it is false because it fails to appreciate the variety and subtlety of language as it is actually used. Okay, yeah, so that's saying about the ambiguity of the meaning of language. Wittgenstein thought that you cannot stand outside of an activity and legislate about it, nor could you import the rules of one game into another. You cannot play football as if it's basketball. He said there are countless different kinds of what we call symbols, words, sentences. New ways of using language come into being and old ones fall into disuse. Okay, Wittgenstein thought you cannot stand outside an activity and legislate it. So what does he mean by standing outside of an activity? Does he mean that you stand in the context of another language game and you try to criticize it from the language game which is outside of the one that you're trying to criticize? And that would link back to what he was saying earlier about language games cannot criticize the player of another. It's like you have to learn the rules of the language game that you're criticizing before you're able to criticize it or get involved in it. And he does make an interesting analogy there between sport. So you can't play football as if it's basketball. You can't just pick up the ball and start bouncing it around in the way that you would do that in basketball, because that's against the rules of that game. So if we look at language games, you play the religious language game in the same way that you can play the scientific language game. Like science might require that you go out and verify the world by empirical testing, but does religion work in that same way, or should we be looking at religion in more of a symbolic type of sense, in a metaphysical sense, seeing what sort of ethical meaning can we derive from religious language that we perhaps can't derive so much from empirical testing and science? So I guess that makes sense. There are countless different ways of what we call symbols, words, sentences. New ways of using language come into being and old ones fall into disuse. Okay, so this is about the transience of language games. They're changing all the time. And I don't know how regularly this happens, but I'm guessing it's quite a lot. And obviously it's going to depend on the context of that specific language game and how it is played. Okay, if we wish to understand what is being said, Wittgenstein argues that we must not try to force it into a predetermined categorical scheme. It is our acting which lies at the bottom of our language game. So this again links to the idea that we can't, that a word doesn't have an innate meaning in itself. It's contingent on the game that it's being played in. It is our acting which lies at the bottom of our language game. Okay, so acting is how we are in the world. It's how we convey ourselves. It's the way that we live our lives, and that lies at the bottom of our language game. Okay, so what does that mean? Does that mean it's the foundation for our language game? So does that mean that whatever we act out in reality is the foundation for the words we use, for the way that we use language? And I guess that raises questions of why do we use language? What is the purpose of language? If our acting's at the bottom of it, then is our language game an attempt to convey a message about the thing that we're acting out? And I think this links to forms of life. expressing a form of life without making statements that are true or false. So, it is our acting which lies at the bottom of our language game. So I would say that that means that acting is the foundation, and then the language game is almost born out of that, perhaps. So we act first, and then we develop the language game. Or the language game comes out of our actions. Perhaps. Here I've done a footnote and said, we mustn't have solid definitions for words because meanings change based on context. And yes, that makes sense, but I think it's deeper than that. It is our acting which lies at the bottom of our language game. I feel like that's quite deep. I think that saying that we shouldn't have solid definitions is linked to here, which says Wittgenstein argues that we must not try to force it into a predetermined categorical scheme. So that's exactly what the logical positivists did with the verification principle. They tried to force language into a predetermined categorical scheme. Which was saying that some statements are analytic, some are synthetic, and some are meaningless. And obviously that's a predetermined. It's trying to pin language down, which is what I might have gone through yesterday, I think, or my last one. Yeah, he suggested that we put cramps onto words by wrenching them out of their living use. We can't use language out of the context that it's being used in outside of a language game. And so to put cramps on the word, which is to use the verification principle, is to use it outside of the context of a language game. And he said that we can't do that. But what I think is really interesting is here, it is our acting which lies at the bottom of our language game. See, I think I need to spend a lot more time thinking about that, but that's definitely something interesting. Lies at the bottom of. So the fact it says lies at the bottom of, I'm not sure if that makes it sound foundational, or if that makes it sound like it's... See, I don't know. I'm going to have to think about that a little bit more. But anyway, I'm going to cut that off there. And the next video we'll be going on to language as public and Wittgenstein on religion. And then that'll pretty much be it. And I've got a table to complete as well, but I won't do anything to do with that in the video. So yeah, I've actually enjoyed making this video. I've done a lot more research into Wittgenstein over the last few days since making that first video, which I don't feel like I got too far with because I didn't really understand much of the content, to be honest. It's complicated stuff, and I think it's something you need to spend a lot of time thinking about. So yeah, I hope this helps anyone who's studying this on an A-level course or whatever. But yeah, thanks for watching.